When I sat down to start writing this sermon, I knew I was going to start with my coming out story. But then I thought, wait, which coming out story? The one where I was jolted into awareness at a bar in Oneonta from a woman from Liverpool? Or the one where I first went to a pride march and saw someone I worked with and realized we had just come out to each other? Or the one where I finally told a member of my family that I was lesbian who replied, well, color me surprised. Or the one how I became an activist and helped lead pride marches and ate fire on the steps of the North Carolina state capitol and protested in gardening gear at the home of Senator Jesse Helms. Showing my age a little bit. But maybe I tell the story of how I came out again to myself a decade later when I realized I maybe wasn't a lesbian. Or the one about how I came out to others as bi after wrestling with the stigma attached to the term bisexual. Or this story, where I am coming out to you, a beloved congregation who has heard so many of my stories over the years, but not this one. Because the truth is, there is no one story we tell. Just as our lives unfold in myriad ways, so do our comings out. There is no one story. Now, it's true that some of the issues we face are shared. The backlash against trans folk, the recent whispers about overturning marriage equality in the Supreme Court, those are issues we share. Yet not every person who falls under the LGBTQIA umbrella will have the same view. You talk to one trans person, for example, you've talked to one trans person. But that one trans person does have a story to tell, maybe many stories to tell. And they are the authority of their own story. You are the authority of your own story. And so is everyone else about theirs. We can't tell people that their stories are wrong. And how rich those stories are. Now this month you've been exploring the topic of deep listening. And part of that is getting our own egos out of the way so we can actually hear each other's stories. Not just coming out stories, although those are rich and notable today, but all the stories of our lives, the stories that shape our identities. In her book, The Power of Stories, the Reverend Jackie Lewis reminds us that our identities are formed by stories told to us, about us, and around us. We are living texts, formed by multiple interweaving, competing, and sometimes conflicting stories that we receive from our culture, via our parents, other adults, our peers, and the media, and congregational life. Stories about race, gender, theology, generational differences, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and class work consciously and unconsciously to form our identity. Stories also teach us values, ethics, and meaning. Stories help us know who we are and who we are not. They create boundaries or borders for us. And out of those things we are told, we create and experience our own stories. We have so many stories. And sometimes we forget how different two seemingly similar people can be because of them. The Zen teacher David Ridnick writes this: in a true encounter with another human being, we come face to face with the mystery of life. In some way, every other person, no matter how well we know them, will remain as mysterious to us as a country across the ocean we only read about in books. When we judge other people other people or other countries by our native standards, we miss the richness and texture of their life and wisdom. We need to learn to be good tourists, to be curious and respectful. We need to appreciate both what is the same and what is different. Too often we get stuck in the trap of believing we already know who someone else is. But whenever we encounter another human being with respect to this essential unknown, we create the possibility for something genuinely new to emerge. In every interaction, whether it is with a stranger or longtime partner or someone in between, we can be surprised by what we have not yet seen or even imagined. Each one of us is different, and each part of us is needed to draw the circle of love wide, a liberative circle where all people can share the wealth of the earth, where hunger, poverty, and homelessness are not tolerated, where discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice are replaced with radical welcome, where peace, love, and trust triumph over fear and hatred. When we listen with a loving heart and an open mind, we help create a world where no one is outside the circle of love. And we need all of our stories if we are to authentically do this work. We need the textures, the tones, the shadings, the dissonance, the harmonies. Dr. Glenn Thomas Rideout, the director of worship at our congregation in Ann Arbor, Michigan, suggests that there is a connection between the composition of music and how we can do this work to draw the circle wide. He asks us to think about the difference between blend and harmony, one requiring sameness and the other requiring difference. So this is how it goes. Right? And I'm going to use my iPad with its little piano on it, so I hope you can hear this. So music is a series of notes played in combination, a chord. Now, when we move from isolated individualism into community, we become musically rich. Each note is articulated, but together the sound is a greater whole. When we seek harmony, we're trying to make things fit together perfectly to be pleasing and familiar. But sometimes it doesn't always work, and there's dissonance. Sometimes we seek the kind of unity where the voices are indistinguishable, like water droplets in a pond. But we're also called to keep individual notes distinct while still making music together. So we can use this analogy of musical harmony when talking about inclusion in our congregations. So think about when we're exposed to a culture that is different than our own. We can either look for only the parts that blend or match with our own lives and reject all the other parts because they don't blend. Or we can welcome the harmonies and noticing that our personal articulated note interacts with others to create sometimes a beautiful and sometimes a dissonant chord. Sometimes we simply overlook the harmonies because we don't understand them enough to recognize them, and that's not helpful either. And so we must listen more deeply to listen to the differences as well as the resonances. This may come somewhat naturally in music, but when it comes to our stories, it doesn't always come naturally. With few exceptions, humans can only really hold one thing at a time. Our cultures create a set of stories and rules that say this is who we are and everyone else is different. Just as our human voices, with few exceptions, can only sing one note at a time. And yet we have all these other stories, these other ways of seeing, these other ways of singing, of hearing, all of these identities. I mean, Just in ourselves, we have all of these identities. I'm not just a woman, I'm a European American, bisexual, cisgender woman who grew up in upstate New York, has a chronic illness, is a minister, a singer, a cat owner, and a West Wing fan. And that's just a little bit of who I am. But when we know that we have all these identities, our stories become richer. So when we hear our stories, don't just believe them. Make space for them. So it starts with shifting the narrative that we buy into. And that's not easy because these are long-held narratives in our culture that won't let go of racism and xenophobia, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, classism, and ableism. These things that keep this culture alive. But admitting that the narratives in our culture just aren't working matters. And so we begin to shift it by checking our assumptions. What are your assumptions about another person's story? Does it ring true? Do you think it may not be? Does a woman speaking passionately in a meeting make you uncomfortable? Do you feel defensive when a person of color points out that you disrespected them? Do you wonder if all of the different pride flags is overkill? What role do stereotypes play in your assessment of what's happening? Do you get frustrated when someone with a disability points out that they can't access some of our spaces? All too often our emotions get in the way of accepting another story as being valid. We dig in our heels and feel some combination of frustration, anxiety, and maybe shame. But we don't have to stop there. We have the opportunity to let those emotions remind us to decentralize ourselves. It takes our asking, who am I in this story? What is the other side of the story? Am I complicit in telling a false or damaging story? So many times we hold on to a narrative because we're so invested in our own view. But remember, we're only ever the main character of our own story. For everyone else, including spouses, parents, children, we're supporting players. And by and large, we're lucky if we're glorified extras. And if it's not our story, we need to listen to the people whose story it is. Whether it is a woman who has been sexually assaulted, or a black man who has been shot by a police officer, or an imam whose Islamic center was burned down by an arsonist, or a trans person who has been misgendered. And more, we have to believe them and trust that they are the authority of their own story. And then we retell, we reconcile, we respond. Because, as Stafford says, if you know the kind of person I am, and I know the kind of person you are, we may be able to correct the narrative and not get lost in the park and find our star. The work of inclusion isn't one and done. It takes attention every day, listening every day, thinking every day about the many identities and stories that exist in us and around us, remembering that your story and mine aren't the only one in this room. The work of inclusion isn't just about saying we're welcoming, but actually being welcoming. Not just making space at the table, but making space in our processes and our behaviors. It takes all of us awake people to be awake. This isn't easy. Nothing I've preached with you over these years has been easy. Well, okay, maybe the pie service was easy for those who remember that. But kindness, justice, compassion, covenant, it's hard work because it's personal work. It's intimate justice. And it requires patience and it requires forgiveness. We all have identities hidden and revealed. We all have experienced joys and sorrows. We all have the cultural and religious settings of our youth and our present. We all have our gender identities and our sexual orientations. We all have experiences we'd rather not have had, and blessings we are grateful to honor. We all have identities. There is no normal. And we tell our complex human stories out of all of these things. They're interesting and informative and tell us things we don't know. And they create the harmony of our congregations, our community, and our lives. So listen to one another's stories. Make space for them. Make it possible for people to tell you who they are. Believe them. Learn from them. And when needed, help make this place a little better for them. Support them. This is how we do the work of liberation. This is how we draw the circle of love wide. They're worth it. You are worth it. We are worth it. I now invite you to join in our closing hymn, Do You Hear?, with lyrics by Unitarian Universalist educator Emily Thorne.
Do you hear, oh my friend, in the place where you stand, through the sky, through the land? Do you hear, in the heights on the plain, in the vale on the main, in the sun, in the rain? Do you hear, through the roar, through the rush, through the throng, through the crush? Do you hear in the hush of your soul, of your soul? Hear the cry, fear won't still, hear the heart's call to will, hear a sigh, startling trill, in your soul, in your soul. From the place where you stand to the outermost strand, do you hear, oh my friend? Do you hear, all the dreams, all the dares, all the sighs, all the prayers? They are yours, mine and theirs. Do you hear,
Each week we make an offering from the bounty that we are blessed to enjoy.